The Western Front of World War I. Greetings, my nocturnal historians. Welcome back to another installment of Boring History for Sleep. I am so glad you are here. Tonight, we travel to one of the darkest, dirtiest, and most miserable places in human history, the trenches of World War I. No glory, no bombastic speeches, just lice, cat-sized rats, and the perpetual hum of artillery ready to kill you before breakfast. You will live through a full day on the Western Front, from the moment the whistle blows before dawn to the ominous silence after nightfall, provided, of course, you live to see it. But for now, you are safe, you are warm. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from today. Feel free to leave a comment. And now, let us begin. There is a particular kind of silence that falls before dawn on the Western Front. It is not peace, nor even the absence of war. It is a held breath, a stillness so absolute that it feels almost supernatural, as if the earth itself does not want to turn, knowing what the sun will bring with it. In this pale, corpse-cold hour, the soldiers rise. They do not rise quickly or with enthusiasm. They rise because they must, because the stand to is not a request, but a ritual. At the edge of every trench across Belgium and France just before sunup, every man must stand, rifle loaded, bayonet fixed, eyes scanning no man's land for what might kill him before breakfast. This tradition, inherited from old battle tactics, is a relic of cavalry charges and saber rattling that is ludicrously out of place amid barbed wire and mustard gas. But it endures because dawn is the witching hour of war, the time when shadows blur and silhouettes deceive. If the enemy is going to attack, they will do it when your limbs are numb, your boots are wet, and your body craves one more hour of dreamless sleep. That is when you die easiest. So the men stand. They stand knee-deep in cold sludge. Their wool greatcoats are stiff with dried mud and old blood. Rifles are clutched in wooden hands. Their faces are drawn from too little food and too much fear. Some blink, trying to contend with the raw mist that creeps into the trench like a second enemy. Others just stare at the horizon, watching the dim orange glow grow behind the line of shattered trees. Not a word is spoken. The stillness remains unbroken, save for the soft click-click of checked bolts and the hiss of breath through clenched teeth. Somewhere down the line, an officer moves like a ghost, inspecting boots, checking for signs of trench foot. It is a grim little dance. This inspection is necessary, but futile. Trench foot here is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. The cold and the damp are constant companions. When the skin on a man's foot begins to rot, it is not a surprise. It is merely on schedule. In this half-life, time bends. 5 minutes feels like an hour. Fingers grow numb. Thoughts drift to home, but not sentimentally. No one is writing poems this morning. They wonder if their dry rations survive the night rats. They pray that the latrine pit isn't full again. They hope they aren't chosen for barbed wire repair. And then, just as the sky begins to blush with light, it happens. An illumination flare pops somewhere distant, white. The light arcs across the sky, hissing. The men freeze, hearts pound, but nothing follows. No whistle, no rattle of machine gun fire, no gas, just the flare. Someone else's stand to, someone else's false alarm, probably. The flare dies, is extinguished in the air like a fading star, and the silence returns again. Then a voice, raspy and non-committal. "Stand down!" And the spell is broken. There will be no breakfast just yet. First, the scraping of mud from the duckboards, the filling of sandbags, the emptying of the latrine barrel, the checking of stores, the moving of ammunition crates that are heavy as coffins. War demands its routines, and those routines are never-ending. But for now, for this moment, they have survived the most dangerous part of the day, the hour of dread, when night dies and the killing can begin again. And as the first real ray of sunlight creeps over the trench wall and spills onto a helmet, the rats come out of the dugouts, bold and fat, to see if any of the men had died during the night. The everyday horror, trench life. After stand to, there is no breakfast, no rest, and certainly no going back to bed. Once the sky is light enough to see the mud in full color, the morning routines begin. Trench fatigue duties were mandatory. Every man had a job, and none of them were glorious. One might be sent to fill sandbags, hauling the same wet earth that tried to kill him yesterday. Another might be assigned to reinforce the parapet, the low sandbag wall facing no man's land. If the parapet crumbled too much under the rain, which it often did, it needed quick rebuilding. A collapsed parapet meant a bullet in the skull. The duckboards that lay on the trench floor were checked and adjusted daily. Without them, men would drown in the mud, sometimes up to their waists in sludge so thick that, according to British records, people occasionally sank in it. Not metaphorically, but literally drowned. And then there was the barbed wire. If the night was quiet enough, a few soldiers would be sent out under the cover of darkness to mend the strands in front of the trench. This wire was critically important. It was meant to slow the enemy attacks just long enough for the machine guns to do their work. But wire patrol was also a death sentence. In one recorded incident from the British 56th Division, over 30% of wire patrols never returned. German snipers and patrols often waited for just this opportunity. So if you saw a man return from wire duty in the morning, you gave him your biscuit. He earned it. Meanwhile, a different kind of horror was stalking the men still in the trench foot. Every morning, junior officers and medical staff had to inspect the soldiers' feet. The process was clinical. Boots off, socks off. Check the skin, look for swelling, blisters, or black patches. Trench foot was caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions. In 1914, the British Army recorded over 20,000 cases in just one winter. If left untreated, it could progress to gangrene, resulting in amputation. Officers were ordered to ensure men rubbed whale oil into their feet daily, changed their socks often, and elevated their feet when possible. Of course, in practice, when the mud rose above the shins and socks were soaked through by 6 a.m., the advice was laughably optimistic. By mid-1915, strict foot care routines were established in many regiments. Men were ordered to remove their boots at least once a day, wipe their feet, and change into one of the 2 precious dry pairs of socks issued to each soldier. The other pair usually hung, frozen, on a line in the dugout, if the rats hadn't stolen them. Rats were their own distinct problem. Attracted by the stench of corpses and the unending food scraps, they proliferated in the walls of the trench. They became fat, bold, and fearless, nibbling on the fingertips of sleeping men or burrowing into the bodies left too long in the shell holes. In a 1916 letter, a British officer wrote, "A rat ran over my face while I slept. I hit it, and it barely flinched." Nevertheless, duties had to be done. If your name wasn't on the latrine roster, you counted yourself lucky. The toilet was usually a board suspended over a deep pit, sometimes shielded by a canvas. More often, it was simply a hole in the ground behind a sandbag curtain. The Royal Army Corps insisted that latrines be placed at least 30 yards from the nearest sleeping place. But in the cramped frontline trenches, this was rarely possible. So the stench hung in the air, thick, damp, and ubiquitous. It stuck to uniforms, stuck in the throat, and masked the smell of what passed for breakfast. There were no showers, no clean water unless you were lucky enough to be near a supply depot, and there was no privacy. Yet, in this swamp of decay, soldiers shaved every day. It was an order. A beard made gas masks less effective. So every morning, men scraped cold skin with dull blades using murky water that was muddy, bloody, or both. It didn't matter. The enemy didn't care if you were clean-shaven, but the gas did. The Rat Kingdom and the Louse Scourge. The trenches had two kinds of enemies. The first shot rifles. The second gnawed at your socks at night and tried to nest in your pack. By 1915, British soldiers were no longer surprised by the rats. They were too numerous, too big, and too confident to be considered mere pests. They ran across the duckboards in broad daylight, brazenly gnawed at cans of bully beef, and stared back with a defiance that could only come from feasting on thousands of unburied corpses. The average trench rat was not small. Soldiers often described them as being the size of house cats, bloated by weeks or months of feasting. The bodies of the dead, often impossible to retrieve from no man's land, were fertile breeding grounds. In official reports and personal letters, soldiers described scenes of rats burrowing into the chests of fallen comrades, hollowing them out from the inside. One British private remarked, "The rats were big enough to fight dogs, and they won." At night, the rats took over. They swarmed over sleeping men. They chewed through haversacks and boots. They bit fingers and noses. They were impossible to escape. A 1917 field diary from the Somme noted, "I woke last night to a weight on my chest. It was a rat, wet and foul, gnawing at the last biscuit in my tin." In some areas, the men would organize hunts for them. Terriers were brought to the front lines not for companionship, but for extermination. One well-trained dog could kill dozens of rats in an hour. Bayonets were often repurposed as rat skewers, but no amount of killing helped. By the time the sun rose, the rats were back, gnawing at ration tins, scurrying over corpses, squealing in the dugouts. French soldiers nicknamed them les foutus, the reapers, or les de la bouillade, the children of the mud. British soldiers called them the trench landlords, or worse, our true commanders. Some believed that the rats could sense an incoming artillery barrage. When they disappeared all at once, the men would look up, mutter a curse, and dive for cover. It often worked. The military issued no standard protocol for rat control. It was considered part of trench life, just another layer of suffering on top of the mud, blood, and fear. Poisoned bait was sometimes laid, but posed as much a risk to the men. Explosives, while satisfying, were discouraged. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on vermin, however monstrous. Besides, the rats always came back. They lived in the walls, the floors, the corpses, the tins, the sandbags. They thrived. If rats ruled the trenches by night, lice ruled them always. They were the invisible enemy, never fully seen, only felt. It would start with a nip, then a bite, then dozens, and then an itch so all-consuming that it turned even the most disciplined man into a scratching, twitching wreck. The itch and the rot. Lice and trench foot. Lice, officially known to the medical corps as Pediculus humanus corporis, human body louse, swarmed in every uniform. They laid their eggs in the seams of the wool clothing, deep where water and soap could never reach. The British Army issued every soldier 2 sets of clothing. After 3 days in the trenches, both were useless. Officers quickly stopped asking if their men had lice. They did. The real question was, how bad is it today? The lice were everywhere. They crawled under collars, nested in armpits, burrowed into hairlines, and left behind red, mottled sores. They didn't just itch, they were a painful torment. By 1915, an estimated 97% of British soldiers on the Western Front were infested. The French and Germans were no luckier. Entire regiments scratched in unison. But lice were not just disgusting, they were dangerous. The worst of them carried a bacterium known as Bartonella quintana, a microscopic killer that caused trench fever. It began subtly, a fever, aching limbs, then headaches, then 5 days in a dugout, delirious, shivering in your louse-infested greatcoat. The only warmth came from your own spiking temperature. It was rarely fatal, but it could incapacitate a man for weeks. And on the front line, there was no time for weakness. Between 1915 and 1918, trench fever afflicted over 1 million soldiers, particularly in the British, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The disease was not fully understood until after the war. At the time, soldiers called it 5-day fever, or just the misery. Efforts to combat the lice were as futile as they were inventive. Men would do a T on their shirts, which meant taking a candle and running the flame over the seams to kill the eggs. It was a common sight. Grown men crouching over a tiny flame, holding their shirts like infernal laundry inspectors. If you saw a glow in a dugout, it wasn't always a lamp. It was likely someone slowly torching their underwear. But even the fire never lasted long. The lice always returned. Hot water was a luxury. Soap was a rumor. And available chemicals like naphthalene scraped from mothballs smelled so toxic that most soldiers refused to use them. They said it stung worse than the louse bites. Eventually, de-lousing stations were set up behind the lines, wooden huts with hot baths and steam machines to boil the uniforms. But to get there, you had to be out of the front line rotation, and for most men, the war did not pause for hygiene. One Royal Army Medical Corps officer noted bitterly in his journal, "The only creatures truly thriving on the Western Front are the lice, and God help us, they may well inherit Europe." If the lice made you itch and the rats kept you awake, trench foot slowly destroyed you from the foundations up. It started with a tingle, a stinging in the toes that you could almost ignore if your rifle was clean and you still had a cigarette. But after a few hours in the damp, numbness set in. And once the numbness set in, the damage was already done. Trench foot was the quiet executioner of the Western Front, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. It was not frostbite. It didn't require freezing temperatures, just cold, damp, and time. And in the trenches, time was the only thing not in short supply. The boots, standard leather army issue, were poor protection against waterlogged ground. Rain, snow, and shattered drainage meant most men stood in ankle-deep mud for 10 to 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. When the feet stayed wet too long, blood circulation slowed. Tissues began to die. First came the whitening of the skin, then swelling, then the flesh turned blue, then black, and then rotted. By the winter of 1915, over 20,000 British soldiers had been diagnosed with trench foot. Some lost toes, others lost entire feet. Many more continued to fight with bandaged, festering sores, unable to feel their steps, but still required to run under fire. The officers were alarmed, not out of sentimentality, but out of statistics. A wounded foot was one less man on the fire step, so the Army enforced protocol: daily foot inspection. If a soldier was found with signs of trench foot, he was pulled from the line, rubbed with whale oil, given dry socks, and granted a day to recover. Whale oil, repurposed from naval stores, became trench gold. It was thick, foul-smelling, and nearly sacred. Men were ordered to rub it into their feet twice daily. Sometimes one tin was passed between 10 men. If you forgot to rub, you risked amputation. If you remembered, you smelled like rancid fishmonger. The irony was brutal. Dry socks were the solution, but dry was a relative term. In most trenches, socks were worn, then wrung out and hung up in dugouts where they collected lice and smoke. They never truly dried. Nevertheless, soldiers cherished them like talismans. Some tied spare pairs around their necks to keep them warm or hide them from thieves. A 1916 diary mentions a corporal caught trading a tin of bully beef for a pair of unworn socks. No one questioned it. They understood, because once trench foot began, the damage was rarely reversible. Gangrene spread fast. Amputation was often done in field hospitals without proper anesthetic. And if you survived the surgery, you were sent home not a hero, but a man who lost his leg to the rain. Some soldiers joked that trench foot was a blighty-itis, a disease that got you out of the war, but most knew it was just another slow, painful way the trenches ate you alive. Survival rations, food and comfort. In theory, soldiers in the trenches were allotted 4,000 calories per day. The number sounds generous, more than most modern diets, but theory does not survive long in a muddy ditch, and calories offer little comfort when they arrive as a brick of biscuit and a tin of mysterious meat that is older than you are. The British Army ration was simple, if uninspiring. A standard issue included a pound of bread or hardtack biscuit, 3/4 of a pound of meat, 4 ounces of bacon, some cheese, tea, jam, sugar, salt, and, if the gods were smiling, a tiny portion of rum. The meat was almost always bully beef, canned, salted, corned beef, so bland and greasy that in cold weather it often solidified into a gray slab. Even the name was sarcastic. There was nothing bully about it. It smelled faintly of brine and defeat. Men ate it cold, with their fingers or a penknife blade, and tried not to think about the texture. The biscuits, known as hardtack, were notorious. They were designed to last, not to please. Hard as rock, sharp on the corners, and dense enough to damage teeth. Many soldiers didn't even try to bite them. They soaked them for hours in tea, soup, or water, or broke them into pieces and mixed them with jam or condensed milk when they had it. One Australian soldier wrote home, "These biscuits they give us, you could roof a trench with them. I used one to hammer in a nail. It worked." Sometimes the rations included McConaughey stew, a canned mixture of beef, turnips, potatoes, and carrots. It was best eaten hot, but it was almost never hot. Fires were forbidden in the frontline trenches. Smoke gave away positions. So most of the time, the McConaughey was eaten straight from the can, cold and gelatinous. It had a strange quality. Warm, it was tolerable. Cold, it was repulsive. Men joked that cold McConaughey could kill a man faster than a shell. Yet they ate it, because there was nothing else. Fresh food rarely made it to the front. Supply lines were long, roads were ruined, and the immense effort of moving crates through the mud meant the Army prioritized what could be stacked, stored, and forgotten. Canned food became more than a meal. It was a metaphor. Uniform, bland, and seemingly endless. There were no plates. Food was eaten out of mess tins, small metal containers that also served as mugs, bowls, and sometimes shovels. Soldiers cleaned them with cold water, with spit, or not at all. A layer of grease, dirt, and tobacco ash was the standard seasoning. Hot food was a luxury, available only in the reserve trenches, often miles behind the front. There, field kitchens could boil potatoes, bake bread, or brew large urns of tea. But at the front, you ate what you carried, and hoped the rats didn't get to it first. Tea, rum, and dreams of life. There were few luxuries in the trenches of World War I, but there was tea. Black, bitter, overbrewed, and often full of crumbs, it was still the one comfort that tasted like home. The British Army issued 1/3 of an ounce of tea per man per day. That's roughly one strong cup, stretched thin. Water was heated in large kettles passed up from field kitchens behind the lines or boiled on makeshift braziers when officers weren't looking. Milk was powdered, sugar was rationed, and clean mugs were a fantasy. But none of that mattered. Tea was a ritual. Tea was warmth in a place where even your breath froze on your rifle. Tea was something to hold on to when everything else was mud, blood, or steel. A hot mug could boost morale better than most speeches. Even when it tasted of trench water and condensed despair, it was welcomed. Men learned to share it, hoard it, trade it. Some added a spoon of jam to cut the flavor. Others let it cool and gulped it like medicine. And then there was rum, issued in small tots, 2 ounces per man per day. Army rum became the unofficial fuel of the Western Front. It was not sweet. It was naval rum, nearly 70% alcohol by volume, and was stored in stone jars sealed with SRD, which stood for Service Rum Diluted. Men joked that it meant seldom reaches his destination. It was usually distributed before stand to, right before the dawn patrol. A splash into a tin mug, a brief burn in the throat, then silence, then orders. It didn't make anyone brave, but it helped steady the hands of some. Rum was also used as medicine. Soldiers with trench fever, influenza, or shell shock were often given a double tot. Doctors prescribed it. Chaplains quietly approved it. Generals? Well, they issued it. Still, there were men who refused. Temperance leagues had a strong pre-war presence, and some soldiers held fast to their beliefs. They were offered tea instead. No one judged them for it. But behind the line, when the cold was creeping in and the mortar fire started again, the sound of a cork popping from the stone jug could lift spirits faster than most prayers. And then there were the things they missed. Fresh bread, hot soup, apples, onions, real eggs, the sound of a spoon clanking against porcelain, not tin. Soldiers talked about food the way dying men talk about heaven. They detailed their mother's roast Sunday in painstaking detail. They recalled pub pies, chips from a street cart, buttered toast, whole milk. Some even wrote down recipes. Trench diaries survive with full, imagined menus. Appetizer, hot onion soup with crusty white bread. Entree, roast beef with horseradish sauce and potatoes. Dessert, custard tart. Beverage, beer, cold and foamy. It was not fantasy. It was survival. Because when your real dinner was a cold tin of meat jelly, the dream of marmalade on toast helped keep you human. If tea was sacred and rum was medicine, the latrine was penance. The war against filth. Sanitation. Sanitation in the trenches was not a small detail. It was a war unto itself, a daily, humiliating battle against grime, disease, and the grim logistics of human biology. Every trench system had its designated sanitary area, a kind term. In reality, it was often a trench dug specifically for waste, usually 4 to 6 feet deep, with a board slung across the top. If the weather was kind, it might be shielded with a canvas for decency. Most were not. They were known simply as latrine trenches, the head, or, less politely, the shit trench. In a well-managed sector of the line, the Royal Army Medical Corps instructed that latrines should be placed at least 30 yards from any cooking or sleeping areas, be dug out daily, and regularly covered with chloride of lime to combat odor and disease. But in the front-line trenches, these instructions quickly crumbled. Mud made digging impossible. Artillery fire caved in pits. And when the latrines filled up, which they always did, men had two choices: wait your turn or find a corner and hope the sergeant didn't notice. Breaching sanitation rules was technically punishable, but punishment presumed someone had the time to enforce rules while dodging machine gun fire and gas. The smell was beyond description. Not just the waste, but the chemical disinfectants, the decomposing flesh, the stagnant water, the wet wool, the tobacco, and the rot. It all hung in the air. It soaked into the wood, the sandbags, the uniforms, even the letters from home. One soldier wrote, "The trench smells worse than death, worse because it lives with you." And following the smell came the disease. Dysentery ran rampant, and intestinal infection spread through contaminated water and poor hygiene. Symptoms: severe diarrhea, dehydration, fever, weakness. It could take a man out of action in hours. Some recovered, some did not. By the middle of the war, the British placed commissioned officers in nearly every sector to monitor and disinfect the latrines daily, but even that was not enough. Men used scrapers, small wooden sticks to clean excrement from their boots. They soaked socks in boiling water to kill bacteria. They were issued trench wipes, squares of cloth, or, when supplies were low, pages from newspapers, field manuals, or letters from home. No one laughed at this. Everything was fuel. Everything was expendable, even dignity. Perhaps the most absurd solution was the portable latrine bucket. In particularly cramped dugouts, a metal bucket with a wooden seat would be placed in the corner. It had a lid. The idea was simple. If the trench cannot accommodate a latrine pit, bring the pit indoors. Someone had to carry it out. The job was rotated. The lowliest man usually drew the short straw. One soldier recalled doing it in 1917. During a bombardment, I held the lid with one hand and God with the other. And yet, like so much in the trenches, it became normal, routine. Just as they cleaned their rifles, boiled water for tea, plucked lice, and braced for the artillery. Because war does not wait for comfort, and trench warfare least of all. The iron chain of command. No army functions without orders, but in the trenches of World War I, orders did not merely structure the day, they dictated survival. Every moment, every move, when to eat, when to sleep, when to climb over the parapet into the mouth of hell, was delivered from the top down, and the chain was unbreakable. The British Expeditionary Force followed a strict hierarchy, from the generals in distant chateaux to the field commanders, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, and, at the very bottom, the private soldier, the Tommy. Most men in the trenches never met anyone above a major. For them, the command came in the form of the lieutenant, barely older than themselves, often from a better school, with polished boots and a face that hadn't yet learned to flinch at the sound of incoming shells. And yet, his word was law. He was the one who decided whether you spent the night fixing barbed wire or boiling your socks, whether you would go over the top in the next attack, whether you would be listed as missing or left behind. Disobedience was not just discouraged, it was criminal. The articles of war were clear. Failing to follow a direct order could result in field punishment, imprisonment, or, in extreme cases, execution. And extreme was subjective. Between 1914 and 1918, over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed by firing squad for crimes ranging from desertion to cowardice, assaulting a superior officer, or even falling asleep on duty. Sleep, the most human of failures. If a man dozed off guarding a post in the trench, a thing entirely understandable after 36 hours without rest, he could be court-martialed and shot within days. The idea was not cruelty, it was deterrence. Commanders feared what might happen if the fear of the enemy ever outweighed exhaustion or compassion. So they made examples. One of the most notorious cases involved Private Harry Farr, a 25-year-old soldier suffering from what was then called shell shock, now recognized as PTSD. He refused to return to the front line. He said he couldn't do it. He shook, he cried, he pleaded. He was shot at dawn in October 1916. The Army knew Farr had been hospitalized multiple times for shell shock. They shot him anyway because the system demanded it. The orders could be mundane: scrape the mud off the latrine wall, deliver rations to the line, stand at attention in the rain during inspection. But even the smallest orders carried weight. A soldier who didn't clean his rifle properly could have his leave revoked. A soldier caught without his helmet could lose his rum privileges. One man who forgot to shave during a gas alert was forced to clean every latrine in the sector for a week. It wasn't about punishment, it was about control. When the world above the trench was chaos, machine guns, mortars, poison gas, the world within had to be governed with near religious discipline. Men needed structure, or they would unravel. Orders provided the illusion of stability. Yet there were moments when the system bent. When junior officers were killed, command devolved to whoever was left standing. Sometimes a corporal led the charge. Sometimes a private crawled forward alone and returned with the only surviving machine gun. Sometimes no one moved, and nothing happened, and the war simply waited. By late 1916, it was clear to many that their superiors were learning about the war at the same pace as the men in the mud. Generals ordered attacks with incomplete maps. Colonels sent men into barrages timed to the wrong minute. Brigades advanced into machine gun fire, believing the enemy had retreated because someone misread a flare signal. One historian would later write, "The First World War was the last great war to be commanded by men who believed courage could outrun bullets." But the orders still came. Advance 200 yards. Hold this section. Reinforce the trench on Hill 60. Prepare for gas. Dig a communication trench to the forward wire. Sometimes they were followed, sometimes they weren't. And when they weren't, reports followed. Court-martials, field punishments. Field punishment number 1 was the most common. A soldier would be tied to a fixed object, a wheel, a gun carriage, a post, for up to 2 hours a day, arms behind his back, legs together, his head exposed to the elements. It was known among the soldiers as the crucifixion. Others were sent to labor battalions, digging latrines for weeks under armed guard. Some were simply transferred to different companies. Their disgrace was passed along the ranks like a warning. And yet inside this machine of discipline, there were cracks of humanity. Sergeants quietly ignored an order that would get men killed. Officers wrote reports that blamed shell confusion instead of naming deserters. Privates covered for one another, swapping names on duty rosters, bribing runners with chocolate or cigarettes to buy an extra hour of sleep. Because no matter how rigid the system, the men inside it were still human, some brave, some broken, all exhausted. And still, the orders came. The language of artillery. Long before a soldier saw the enemy, he heard them. Artillery defined World War I more than any other weapon. It sculpted the landscape, dictated the pace of battle, and buried more men than rifles, gas, or disease combined. The Western Front was not a place of fleeting skirmishes and cinematic charges. It was a continental orchestra of heavy guns, a soundtrack of distant thunder that never truly stopped. By the time most soldiers arrived in the trenches, they had learned to distinguish the different voices in that thunder. Artillery had its own language. There was the slow, high-arcing thump of the howitzer, hurling shells high into the air that dove into dugouts and trenches like the fist of God. There was the sharper, flatter crack of the field gun, whose shells whistled over the parapet with terrifying speed. And there was the nauseating whine of incoming shells, a sound that started too high to hear, then dropped in pitch as the shell approached, culminating in a sudden and sickening silence just before impact. Most men quickly learned to distinguish our shells from theirs, not by sight, but by sound and timing. British and French shells had one rhythm. German shells had another. Some soldiers swore they could tell the make of the shell by the way it whistled through the air, and they were often right. It was not uncommon for veterans to develop an instinctive reaction, to duck, to turn, to dive, just by hearing a change in the pitch. For the fresh recruits, it was a brutal education. They either learned fast or they died confused. The scale of artillery fire during the war is difficult to comprehend. At the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British Army fired 1.5 million shells in the 5 days leading up to the attack. The goal was to annihilate the German defenses, turn the barbed wire into rags, the trench lines into rubble, and morale into dust. But in many cases, the wire held, the bunkers withstood, and the defenders were ready. The result was devastating. The British forces lost 57,000 men on the first day alone. And yet the guns kept firing. Certain sectors of the front, like Verdun, endured continuous artillery fire for months. Between February and December 1916, the French and German armies together fired an estimated 40 million shells on a front barely 20 miles wide. Entire forests vanished. Villages ceased to exist. The earth was turned into a moonscape of overlapping craters and blasted tree stumps. One historian described Verdun not as a battlefield, but as a place where the very earth was at war. For the soldiers on the ground, the barrages became a constant part of life. They interrupted sleep, conversation, and digestion. They caused collapses in the trench walls. They brought down dugouts and frayed nerves. Shells did not always kill. Often they maimed, taking arms off shoulders, legs off hips, or faces off skulls. And sometimes they just buried men alive under tons of wet earth thrown up by a near miss. Men came to fear the near miss more than the direct hit. A shell that landed directly on you was likely to kill instantly. A shell that landed nearby tore your sector apart, collapsed your dugout, and left you screaming for a medic who couldn't reach you in time. The condition of artillery. Shell shock. There was no pattern to it, no rhythm to trust. Randomness was part of the horror. Shells fell without warning. A quiet sector could erupt in a barrage without the slightest provocation, and an area that was wiped off the map yesterday could be shelled again today, just to make sure. Even the air participated in the terror. On damp days, the shells felt closer. The explosions were muffled, but more pervasive. On cold days, the crack rang sharper. In fog, the flashes were bright but disoriented, like ghosts fighting in the mist. Men huddled in dugouts, which they have suspected were their coffins. They plugged their ears with filthy rags, tried to sleep in shifts, and counted the seconds between salvos as if it were a perverted lullaby. Eventually, some stopped reacting at all. They would stare blankly ahead, lips moving without sound, eyes vacant. The Army had a term for this: shell shock. At the time, it was poorly understood, often dismissed as cowardice or emotional weakness. Today, we know it as trauma. Yet they endured because they had to, because the shells never stopped, and neither did the war. Artillery was not a moment, it was a condition. It did not come and go like a cavalry charge or an infantry skirmish. It lived with the soldiers. It was part of the air they breathed, the earth they slept on, and the dreams they woke from screaming at night. Once the first shells fell, there was no true quiet again, not in the body nor in the mind. To live under barrage was to live inside a storm that never fully subsided. Most trenches were built with this in mind. The frontline trench, closest to the enemy, was designed narrow, zigzagged, and low profile to minimize the impact of shrapnel and flying debris. Behind it, the reserve and support trenches held the supply lines, field kitchens, medical posts, and what passed for relative safety. But even these deeper positions were vulnerable. Artillery reached everywhere, and precision was theoretical at best. The average soldier quickly learned that no trench was ever truly safe. Artillery was indiscriminate. It fired by pattern, by grid, by saturation. Shells didn't aim for people, they aimed for areas. To be in the wrong place at the wrong time was not merely bad luck, it was inevitable. During a barrage, men would drop face down into the mud or scramble into dugouts, timber-lined caves dug into the trench walls, reinforced with sandbags and corrugated iron. Some went as steep as 30 feet, but most were shallow, hastily built, and barely held. When a serious shelling began, men would huddle in these dark holes, counting the seconds between impacts. The closer the explosion, the harder the ground shook. Candles flickered. A rain of dust and splinters fell from above. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing the sour air of unwashed uniforms, cigarette smoke, and fear. Some prayed, some cursed, some sat in absolute silence. In heavy barrages, like at Passchendaele or the Somme, the explosions didn't come in intervals. They came as a rolling wall of thunder, overlapping, deafening. Conversation was impossible. Men communicated by tapping shoulders or drawing in the mud with shaking fingers. Outside, the very earth was changing. Soil erupted in columns. Trenches caved in on themselves. Duckboards splintered. Sandbags burst like flour sacks. Men on sentry duty vanished under flying debris or were simply not found afterward. Sometimes the dead were visible. A boat sticking out of the mud, an arm reaching from a crater. Other times, there was nothing to retrieve. Medical units quickly realized that most artillery wounds were not clean. Shell fragments tore through flesh, carrying mud, fabric, and metal deep into the wound. Amputation became a standard response. Even minor shrapnel wounds could turn deadly if infection set in, and in the trenches, infection always found a way. But artillery didn't just wound bodies, it mutilated nerves. By 1915, military doctors began noticing a growing number of soldiers who returned from bombardments physically intact but mentally altered. They flinched at loud noises, stuttered, twitched, or wept uncontrollably. Some could not speak, others could not sleep. Some had to be restrained at night to stop them from scratching their faces. This was called shell shock, a new term for a new kind of suffering. At first, it was believed to be caused by physical concussion, the brain damaged by the shock wave of an explosion. But over time, it became clear that even soldiers far from the immediate blasts suffered the same symptoms. It was psychological, it was cumulative, and it was everywhere. A 1917 British War Office report showed that over 40% of medical discharges during the war were due to psychological trauma. Much of this was traced back to artillery exposure. France saw similar numbers. In Germany, the condition was called Kriegsneurose, war neurosis. And while some commanders treated it as a legitimate injury, many did not. A soldier who shook, wept, or refused to go back to the front was called a coward. Some were imprisoned, some were executed, but most were simply sent back to the line. The logic was cruel and cyclical. The only way to prove you were not suffering from shell shock was to endure another barrage. And so, day after day, week after week, men huddled in craters or cowered in dugouts while the sky broke apart above them. They began giving the guns nicknames, like whiz-bangs, Jack Johnsons, and toffees. Each nickname was a small attempt to domesticate the terror. They laughed at shells that missed, toasted the ones that killed rats instead of men, and shared rumors of some mythical German gun that could fire 20 miles inland. They clung to superstitions that the first shell never hits, that the third is the one to fear, that if you can still hear it, you're safe. But they never forgot. Years later, long after the mud had dried and the trenches were filled in, former soldiers would go silent during thunderstorms. Some could no longer bear the sound of fireworks. Some never spoke of the war because the artillery had stopped, but the echo remained. Over the top. There was no moment in trench warfare more dreaded, more fatal, or more absurd than the order to go over the top. It began with a whistle. 3 short blasts sounded from the mouth of a junior officer or company sergeant. It was sharp, unmistakable. It was impossible to mistake for anything else. No warning, no negotiation. Once the whistle blew, the men moved, or at least they were expected to. The phrase "over the top" referred to the action of climbing out of the relative cover of the trench and charging across no man's land. That shattered, barren strip of mud and wire separating the opposing lines. It could be 50 yards wide, or 500. It could be clear of obstructions, or choked with shell craters, shattered tree stumps, and the bodies of the men who didn't make it yesterday. No man's land was never quiet. It was crossed at night by patrols, lit by flares, sown with explosives, and littered with the dying. But during an attack, it became a killing field. The attack was usually planned in advance, timed to the second, with artillery pre-planned to lay down a creeping barrage just ahead of the advancing troops. In theory, the barrage would suppress the enemy, destroy their machine gun nests, and allow the infantry to walk in and take the trench. The reality was different. Artillery rarely destroyed the enemy wire, and even more rarely knocked out all the machine guns. In the first moments of the attack, soldiers emerged into a landscape that looked empty, but wasn't. German defenders, huddled in concrete and steel-reinforced dugouts, waited for the barrage to cease. The moment it did, they scrambled back up, set up their guns, and opened fire. The result was often a slaughter. At the Somme in July 1916, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches at 7:30 a.m., confident that a week of artillery fire had cleared the way. Within minutes, thousands were dead. On the first day alone, the British forces lost over 19,000 killed and 38,000 wounded. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. Formations were rigid. Officers often ordered men to advance in lines, shoulder to shoulder, rifles at the ready, packs on their backs, as if they were still fighting a 19th century war. The idea was to maintain unit cohesion and make the advance easier to manage, but against machine guns firing hundreds of rounds a minute, it was suicide. The machine gun was the great equalizer of the war, efficient and ruthlessly impersonal. The German MG-08 and the British Vickers gun fired around 500 rounds per minute. One well-placed crew could mow down an entire company before the men were halfway across. And yet they went. Not because they wanted to, but because the orders were clear. The whistle had blown. Men flung their rifles onto the parapet, grasped the edge of the trench wall, and hauled themselves up, often with the help of comrades. Sandbags crumbled beneath their boots. The mud sucked at their feet. Sometimes they slipped back, dazed or shamed. Sometimes they froze at the top, straddling the wall, eyes wide. Sometimes they ran. They carried between 60 and 80 pounds of gear: rifles, bayonets, ammunition, water bottles, gas masks, entrenching tools, grenades, sometimes wire cutters or shovels. In the thick mud, this was enough to literally drown. Men sometimes had to be pulled out of shell craters like they were sinking. Boots were lost, ankles were broken, packs were cut away on the run. And yet, they advanced. Smoke from the artillery hung in the air, making visibility impossible. The sun glinted off helmets. Gas sometimes drifted back over their own lines. And everywhere, the sound, the crackle of rifles, the roar of the machine guns, the wounded screaming, calling for medics who couldn't reach them. Survival was random. One man might run 200 yards unscathed, while another died before his foot touched the top rung of the ladder. Medals were rare. More often, names were logged in journals, attached to personal effects, and reported back to families in quiet towns who couldn't imagine what the phrase "missing in action" truly meant. Sometimes the attack succeeded. The enemy trench was taken. Prisoners were hauled back. A small piece of shattered ground was won. And almost invariably, it was lost again in the next counterattack. Lines shifted a few hundred yards in either direction over months. Thousands died for every inch. Going over the top was not a moment of heroism. It was a ritual of exhaustion, performed because someone far away, looking at a map, deemed it necessary. And so, the men waited for the whistle. Once a man left the safety of the trench, he entered a space that belonged to neither him nor the enemy. No man's land was precisely what it claimed. Nobody's, ungoverned and often uninhabitable. It stretched like a scar between the opposing lines, varying from 30 to several hundred yards. No man's land. There were no clean lines, no signs, no paths. It simply was a tangled wasteland of barbed wire, craters, blasted trees, and rotting corpses. The earth itself was churned up by months of artillery fire, pockmarked and unstable. Entire sections were nothing more than sucking mud pits, ready to swallow a man whole if he misjudged his footing. Soldiers had to leap from crater to crater, dodging wire entanglements, ducking snipers, and praying the next step didn't end in a trip flare or a bullet. The landscape was shaped not so much by nature as by artillery. Millions of shells had created a grotesque topography. In some sectors, like Ypres and Passchendaele, the ground became so waterlogged that drainage was impossible. The British Army tried laying down duckboards and sandbag paths, but they were temporary and often destroyed by the very shelling that preceded the attacks. According to military records, drowning in no man's land was not uncommon. Men who fell into water-filled shell craters, burdened with packs and rifles, sometimes couldn't climb out. Witnesses described hearing desperate cries, then seeing the mud close over their comrades moments later. The horror was so mundane it ceased to shock. Soldiers pressed on, eyes forward, stepping over limbs and bodies as if they were debris. The barbed wire was the next barrier. It became one of the most effective killers of the war, not because it struck, but because it trapped. Defensive positions often stretched in belts 30 yards wide, laced with tripwires, entanglements, and hidden stakes. Artillery was supposed to destroy the wire before an attack, but in practice this rarely happened. Even direct hits often failed to sever all the strands, and any wire remaining could funnel attacking troops into killing zones. Machine gunners knew exactly where those choke points were. Many men carried wire cutters, but using them under fire was nearly impossible. Entire platoons were killed, tangled in the wire, limbs caught, uniforms ripped, screaming as bullets found them. One officer wrote in his journal, "We were caught like rats in nets. We could do nothing but bleed. The machine guns did the rest." The German MG-08, based on Hiram Maxim's original design, could fire up to 500 rounds per minute. placed in reinforced concrete bunkers called pillboxes, often with overlapping fields of fire. It created what commanders described as curtains of lead. Any open advance across no man's land was met with instant, continuous fire. Bullets cut men down in seconds, and the advance stalled before it reached the enemy lines. Survivors dropped into craters for cover and were forced to wait, sometimes for hours, until nightfall or until a shell or a bayonet found them. Despite these dangers, some men reached the enemy trenches. Those who made it often found themselves in hand-to-hand combat, where rifles were discarded in favor of grenades, bayonets, shovels, and fists. The brutality was unprecedented. Unlike the distant, impersonal killing of artillery, trench fighting was primal and immediate. The confined spaces of the trench corridors left no room to maneuver. There was nowhere to hide. Soldiers described the smell: blood, cordite, sweat, excrement. The sounds: screams, panting, blades hitting bone. The fighting ended quickly. Victory, if it came, meant capturing a short section of trench, clearing it out, and preparing for the inevitable counterattack. The cost of even partial advance was staggering. During the Battle of Loos in 1915, the British advanced only 2 miles at the cost of nearly 60,000 casualties. The Battle of Arras in 1917 led to an advance of roughly 3.5 miles at over 160,000 British casualties. These were considered successful operations. In other words, a few hundred yards of pockmarked wasteland cost tens of thousands of lives and often had to be fought for again the next week. And yet, despite the carnage, the ritual continued. Troops were drilled on how to cross no man's land, fix bayonets, maintain formation, do not stop to aid the wounded, do not lose cohesion, do not look back. Officers used whistles, bugles, and even handkerchiefs tied to sticks to signal the attack time. The instructions were simple, because the outcome was not. What happened once you left the trench was out of anyone's hands. Some men ran, some crawled, others walked slowly, knowing they would die and unwilling to rush it. Others froze, collapsing mid-sprint, too terrified or wounded to continue. There are accounts of men advancing through gas clouds, coughing and blinded, trying to maintain formation. Others carried stretchers, trying to retrieve friends or officers. Some played dead for hours, covered in someone else's blood, forcing themselves not to cough or move when boots passed inches from their heads. For those who survived the crossing, no man's land never left them. Veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, how quiet it seemed there just before the shooting started, how the morning hoarfrost lay on the corpses like snow, how the flares cast dancing shadows on the barbed wire at night. It became less a place than a memory, a ghostly plain between the past and the future, between life and what came next. Gas warfare, Ypres, 1915. When poison gas was first used on a large scale in modern warfare, it came with the wind. On April 22, 1915, near the town of Ypres in Belgium, the German army released over 160 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders positioned along their trenches. The target was a 4-mile stretch defended primarily by French colonial troops, including Algerian and Moroccan units. There was no warning, no whistle, no artillery barrage. Just a sudden, strange fog rolling low across the battlefield. Pale green and ghostly, hugging the contours of the earth, it moved relentlessly toward the Allied lines. At first, the soldiers didn't understand what they were seeing. Fog was common in Flanders, but this was not fog. It had a metallic odor, sharp and pungent. Some described it as like pepper or bleach. Then came the coughing, then the choking, then the panic. Chlorine reacts with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, effectively turning every breath into chemical torture. The gas burned from the inside out. Soldiers dropped their rifles, clutched at their throats, and fell as their lungs filled with fluid. Death could come in minutes or hours. Those who didn't die immediately were often permanently damaged, burned, lungs scarred, speech ruined. Survivors fled in chaos, leaving a gaping hole in the Allied line. The Germans, unprepared for their own success, hesitated to exploit the breach. Their own troops had only been issued primitive masks, cloth pads soaked in urine or baking soda. Commanders were uncertain if it was safe to advance. The moment was lost. The line was eventually restored, but the world had changed. The age of chemical warfare had begun. The psychological impact of that first gas attack was as devastating as the physical damage. News spread quickly through the Allied trenches. The enemy had deployed a weapon that could not be seen, could not be shot, and could not be outrun. It floated in with the wind and turned the very air into poison. The very invisibility of the threat added a new layer of terror to a battlefield already saturated with fear. The British and French responded with outrage, citing the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which explicitly forbade the use of asphyxiating gases in war. But their outrage did not last long. Within weeks, they were developing their own chemical weapon programs. Within months, they were using gas on the battlefield themselves. Gas warfare became a constant presence on the Western Front. Cylinders were buried behind the trench lines, connected by hoses, and used when wind conditions were favorable. Later, shells filled with gas allowed for more targeted delivery. The types of gas also evolved. Chlorine was soon joined and largely replaced by phosgene, which was even more lethal and less detectable. Then came mustard gas. First deployed by the Germans in July 1917, it did not need to be inhaled to do damage. It burned the skin, causing painful blisters, and lingered in the soil for days, contaminating entire sections of trench. Mustard gas was insidious. It did not kill instantly. In fact, it was designed not to. Its true power lay in incapacitation. Soldiers exposed to it were blinded, blistered, and sick, unable to fight, but not dead. This overwhelmed medical units, strained supply lines, and clogged the evacuation chains. One shell could render dozens of men helpless for days. Logistically, it was a brilliant, if terrifying, tactic. Defense improved over time, but never became reliable. In the early months, soldiers were told to urinate on a cloth and hold it over their face. The uric acid neutralized the chlorine. Later, proper gas masks were issued, canvas hoods with glass eye slits and primitive filters. By 1916, these were improved to include charcoal filters and better facial seals, but they were still hot, uncomfortable, and prone to fogging. In the chaos of battle, many soldiers ripped them off to breathe easier, exposing themselves to the invisible death. Even with training and equipment, gas remained the wild card. The wind could shift without warning. Entire divisions were known to gas themselves accidentally when the breeze changed. Some gas shells burst too high, scattering ineffectively. Others burst too low, contaminating friendly trenches. And the constant presence of gas made the daily trench life even more unbearable. Men were forced to sleep with their masks at hand, to drill in them, eat in them, march in them. By the end of the war, an estimated over 1.3 million men were gassed in World War I. Of those, about 90,000 died, a relatively low fatality rate compared to artillery or disease. But the long-term effects were staggering. Thousands suffered for the rest of their lives. Lung damage, blindness, skin lesions, PTSD rooted not in explosions or bullets, but in the smell of raw earth and the quiet hiss of a drifting fog. A gas attack did not begin with a shell burst or a rattle of gunfire. It began with a silence, followed by a sharp, unexpected hiss. Sometimes it came with the wind, carried over the open fields in an unnatural green or yellow fog. Other times it arrived in canisters, discharged from enemy trenches, their detonation muffled but unmistakable. Still others, it was delivered by artillery shell, bursting just above the ground and releasing its invisible payload over the lines. Either way, there was no time to think. The warning came as a cry, not a command. Gas! Gas! And chaos followed. Soldiers were trained to don their masks in 7 seconds. In reality, it took longer. Men fumbled with the rubber straps, tore the eyepieces, or put them on backward. Some had masks damaged by rain or rough handling. Others had none at all. The horror of the invisible. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard. Many were asleep when the gas arrived, woken by a comrade's scream or the burn of chlorine in their throat. There are countless stories of men waking to find their dugout already full of gas, crawling toward the exit only to realize they were too late. Once exposed, the symptoms were near instantaneous. Chlorine burned the eyes, throat, and lungs. In moments, a man's vision blurred, his chest tightened, and a coughing fit seized him. It was a dry, hacking cough that quickly became wet and frothy as fluid filled the lungs. Breathing felt like drowning. Speech was impossible. Panic was inevitable. Phosgene, which replaced chlorine in many attacks, was harder to detect and far more deadly. It smelled faintly of newly mown hay or green corn, pleasantly, almost pastorally. By the time the symptoms emerged, it was often too late. Soldiers exposed to high doses might feel fine for an hour before collapsing. Lungs destroyed, they couldn't take a full breath. There was no cure. Medical teams could offer little more than morphine and a place to die. Mustard gas, eperite, which came later, brought a different kind of suffering. It was a vesicant or blistering agent that soaked through the skin as well as being inhaled. Men exposed to it would find their skin reddening within hours, then blistering, then peeling off. The gas penetrated uniforms and masks. It attacked the eyes, causing temporary or permanent blindness. It settled in the soil and remained there for days, contaminating entire sections of trench. Medical reports describe men arriving at aid posts with faces so swollen they couldn't speak or open their mouths, their eyelids glued shut with yellow pus, their skin peeling in strips. During a gas attack, the trenches devolved into confusion. Orders were shouted but unheard. Medics moved blindly. Machine guns fell silent. Men pressed rags to their faces, urinated on scarves to create makeshift filters, or simply ran. Some, in panic, tore off their masks, gasping for the clean air that wasn't there. Others froze, huddled in corners with their eyes closed, their hands pressed over their mouths. In the worst cases, men thrashed in the mud like drowning animals, lungs filling with fluid while their comrades watched helplessly. Gas masks improved over time, from simple gauze pads to full-face respirators with filters and valves, but they were far from perfect. In the early years, even trained soldiers found the masks disorienting. They fogged up quickly. The rubber was hot and stifling. Communication was impossible. Many soldiers described the feeling of wearing the mask as a kind of choking in itself, like being buried alive, just to avoid death from the air. After the attack passed, the consequences lingered. The trenches smelled of chemicals and rot. Gas, especially mustard gas, clung to clothing and skin. Men stripped their uniforms and washed with cold water if they could. Most just wiped themselves down with rags and hoped for the best. The wounded were evacuated by the dozens, their eyes bandaged, their lungs rasping with every breath. Many never returned to the line. Gas survivors were often easy to spot later on. Their lungs remained damaged. Their voices were raspy. Some suffered chronic coughing fits for the rest of their lives. Others were blinded. Some lost the ability to speak entirely, their vocal cords eaten away by acid. And yet, the war continued. Soldiers learned to live with the constant threat of gas. They slept with their masks hanging over their beds. They drilled for gas as often as they cleaned their rifles. Some began to recognize the subtle signs: the direction of the wind, a sudden silence from the enemy, a drifting haze across the ground. Superstition crept in. Some believed the smell of bleach was a warning. Others swore by talismans hidden in their masks or helmets. By 1918, gas had become routine. The horror never faded, but the surprise was gone. It was just another way to die. The great irony was this: for all its terror, gas accounted for a small percentage of battlefield deaths, less than 3% of the total casualties on the Western Front. But its psychological effect far outweighed the statistics. It made the very air untrustworthy. It turned breathing into a danger. It blurred the lines between life and death, between fighting and choking. And for those who survived it, the war never smelled the same. The invisible wounds. Shell shock. PTSD. Not all the wounds of the Great War were visible. Some bled inward, quietly, persistently, shaping the rest of a man's life after his uniform was folded away. These were the wounds that had no scar, no bandage, no clear place to point and say, "Here is where I was hurt." And in the early years of the war, few knew how to name them, but the soldiers did. They called it shell shock. The term first entered medical usage in 1915 as British doctors began recording strange cases. Men who shook uncontrollably, who couldn't speak, who wept for hours without reason, or screamed at the sound of boots on gravel. Some went blind, though their eyes were unharmed. Others lost the ability to stand, eat, or sleep. Many developed severe tics, mutism, or paralysis that had no physical explanation. And most had one thing in common: they had recently survived an artillery barrage. Initially, shell shock was believed to be caused by the force of concussion, a literal jarring of the brain inside the skull by nearby explosions. It seemed logical. Artillery was everywhere. Its noise was relentless. The shock waves rippled through the ground and the air, slamming into bone and blood like invisible fists. But then came reports of soldiers suffering the same symptoms who had never been near a blast. They hadn't been shelled, hadn't been thrown against a wall or even wounded, and yet they trembled. They stuttered. They could not return to the front. Some could not even walk. It became clear that this was not a physical wound, or not solely one. It was a psychological trauma caused by the prolonged exposure to fear, death, and the relentless pressure of industrial warfare. But in an era before the language of PTSD, these men were often misunderstood by doctors, officers, and even fellow soldiers. In the British Army, attitudes toward shell shock were divided. Some military doctors, like Charles Myers, treated it as a legitimate and serious condition. Others saw it as cowardice under a mask, a convenient excuse for men who simply couldn't take the pressure. Treatment varied widely. Some were sent to sanatoriums for rest, therapy, and medical care. Others were ordered back to the line. Still others were punished, tied to posts, deprived of food, or put on court-martial. Over the course of the war, the British Army alone officially recorded over 80,000 cases of shell shock. The true number was likely higher. In Germany, it was called Krieg Neurose. In France, commotion cérébrale. Every army had its own language for the same breakdown, proof that it belonged not to one nation or temperament, but to the war itself. And yet there was little compassion. The Western Front did not allow for prolonged recovery. Soldiers who showed signs of psychological breakdown were often withdrawn, patched up with rest and sedatives, and returned within days or weeks. Few could afford to lose able-bodied men, and so the war devoured them twice. Many broke down during combat. During long barrages, it was common to see men clawing at the dirt, eyes wide, rocking back and forth. Some would curl up in the corners of dugouts, muttering to themselves. Others would simply walk away from the front line in a daze, unaware they were deserting. A small number became aggressive, attacking officers, throwing away rifles, or refusing to obey orders. These were the most dangerous cases, not to others, but to themselves. In a few tragic instances, men suffering from shell shock were tried for desertion or cowardice and executed. Private Harry Farr, a 25-year-old Londoner who had served at the front since 1914, he broke down repeatedly, unable to continue, and was shot in 1916. He was not afforded legal counsel. His wife later received the standard telegram and a widow's pension. Farr's case was re-examined almost a century later, in 2006. He and 306 other British soldiers executed for military offenses during World War I were posthumously pardoned by the British government. For those who survived, shell shock did not end with the armistice. Many returned home changed. Families spoke of once cheerful sons who now stared out windows for hours, flinched at sudden sounds, or wept in their sleep. Nightmares were common. Depression was persistent. Some could not hold a job. Some never spoke of the war again. Others could speak of nothing else. Medical understanding improved slowly. Shell shock became a foundational moment in the development of modern psychiatry. It forced military and civilian medicine to recognize that war wounds more than the flesh. It damages the mind, and sometimes those wounds never truly heal. But in the trenches, amid the daily routine of mud, hunger, and orders, there was no room for introspection. At night, when the guns finally fell silent and the flares stopped rising, and only the wind moved across no man's land, the men were left alone with their thoughts. And that, for many, was the most dangerous part. Night duties. When the sun set over the Western Front, the war did not end. It merely changed shape. The darkness in the trenches was not a reprieve. It was a transition from open combat to quieter, more intimate dangers that crept under the cover of night. The threat of artillery was replaced by the hiss of the flare. Machine guns fell silent, but sniper fire continued. Men still died after sundown, just slower and often quieter. There was no electricity, no lights, save for a few dimly lit lamps in the dugouts. The trenches became a world of silhouettes. Figures hunched against the wall, rifles stacked like bones, boots scraping on the duckboards, slick with slime. The smell, always present, seemed to settle heavier in the cool air. Chlorine, sweat, cordite, wet wool, old blood. Nothing in nature smelled like this. Nothing ever would again. In some sectors, the night began again with stand-to, a final check for surprise attacks at twilight, just as there was at dawn. Men lined the fire step, bayonets fixed, eyes scanning the no-man's land they could not see. The procedure was mechanical, almost ceremonial. Most nights nothing happened, but to skip it would be suicide. Dawn and dusk were the enemy's favored hours. Afterward came the rations, the second meal of the day, if it arrived at all. Supply parties made their runs under the cover of darkness, hauling boxes of food, water, and sometimes letters from home. The most dangerous part of these trips was not the weight of the supplies, it was the silence needed to carry them. One dropped crate, one shout, and the enemy could send a mortar barrage to wipe out the entire effort. Many men were killed simply trying to bring bread to the front line. Dinner was cold, usually cold bully beef, cold tea, cold hands. If a stove could be lit in a deep enough dugout, someone might warm a tin of stew. But hot food was a luxury. Most just chewed in the darkness, helmets on, eyes darting upward at every sound. Any sudden noise, a rat, a dropped rifle, the creak of a board, could summon a rain of steel from above. The terror of the night, sleep and patrols. Sleep, when it came, was taken in 2-hour shifts. The dugouts were crowded, damp and noisy. There was no bedding, only what a man could find: an extra greatcoat, a sandbag, a rolled-up tunic used as a pillow. Men slept sitting up, knees pulled to their chests, or lying flat in a corner of the dugout, boots on, gas mask within reach. On colder nights, they huddled together for warmth, not speaking, just breathing, just enduring. Sentry duty was posted throughout the night. Their job was simple and cruel: watch the dark, listen, wait. If they failed, if they dozed off or missed a movement in the shadows, their unit might not survive the morning. Some sentries broke under the pressure. Others simply froze in place when it was time to shout. Both outcomes carried consequences. Beyond the wire, the enemy moved. Night patrols crawled into no man's land in small groups, sometimes to mend barbed wire, sometimes to sabotage the enemy, sometimes just to listen. These missions were among the most dangerous of the war. One wrong move could give away their position. If they were caught, there was no rescue. Many patrols simply vanished, never to reappear. Their names were added to casualty lists, marked presumed dead. The silence of the night was not true silence. It was layered. There were the sounds of shovels digging new trenches, water being passed down the line in dented canteens, men whispering of home, of food, of the next attack. There were the groans of the wounded, quiet and persistent, the occasional scream, sudden and short, when a man's nerves finally gave way. And over it all, the constant rustling of the rats, untouched by bullets or gas, thriving in the filth. Sometimes men wrote letters. They did so by candlelight on scraps of paper with pencil sharpened by knife. The words were careful, censored, always optimistic. "We are holding the line. Don't worry about me. The food is not bad." What they didn't say, couldn't say, was that they hadn't washed in weeks, hadn't slept properly in days, and had seen friends torn apart by high-explosive shells. Yet the letter helped. It built a bridge between the trench and the world outside, a reminder that they were not only soldiers, but sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, that there was something beyond the wire worth crawling toward. When the candles burned low and the letters were sealed, most men tried to sleep again. If they were lucky, the guns were quiet. If not, morning came early, in fire, in screams, in the whistle that meant the war had begun again. The cost of survival in the trenches of World War I. Survival in the trenches of World War I was rarely a victory. It was a condition, a question answered differently each day. The cost was measured not only in lost limbs or spilled blood, but in the slow depletion of the soul. A soldier who endured a full tour on the front line, who withstood the gas, the shells, the lice, the hunger, the fear, and the orders, did not emerge unchanged. Even in moments of quiet, the war lingered. It was in the dampness of their clothes, the tremor in their hands, the ringing silence left by explosions. The body might heal, the nerves did not. Some called it luck, to wake up in the same trench you fell asleep in, to return from patrol, to make it across the wire. But over time, luck took on a different meaning. It was not surviving the attack, but being sent home, wounded, gassed, shell-shocked, invalided out. That, many believed, was true survival, the release. Not an escape from duty, but from the slow certainty of attrition. Because every soldier, eventually, knew his time would come. The average life expectancy for a soldier on the front line of the Western Front was measured in weeks in some sectors. In places like the Somme or Passchendaele, a fresh battalion could expect 50 to 70% casualties within days. Entire towns in Britain and France lost generations. Brothers were buried in the same mud, only trenches apart. Friends disappeared into clouds of earth, never found, never named. And yet the men stayed. Not for glory, the war burned that out by 1915. And not for medals, though they were awarded, pinned on, and saluted. They meant little compared to the weight of memory. Most soldiers stayed because they had no choice. Orders were orders. Cowardice was punished. And desertion, real or perceived, was met with a firing squad at dawn. But beyond that, they stayed for each other. The trenches broke men, but they also bound them. Camaraderie became a lifeline. The man who shared your last biscuit, who pulled you out of a shell hole, who lit your cigarette after stand to, he mattered more than kings or causes. In the strangest way, the war created a kind of family, forged not in blood, but in fire, earth, and cold. When the war finally ended, on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, many of those who survived found the silence more deafening than the guns. Peace came not with jubilation, but with bewilderment. What now? What next? After 4 years of digging, marching, killing, watching, waiting. For many, the answer was nothing. They returned home, to quiet streets and unfamiliar faces. They couldn't describe where they'd been, what they'd seen. The war had changed their survivors in ways the photographs did not capture. Some took up farming, some drank, some wrote books, some said nothing at all. Governments called them heroes, newspapers printed parades, statues were erected. But in the hearts of those who endured it, the war was not a clean thing, not a victory or a defeat. It was a memory, stained into the skin like trench mud, always there, always damp, always waiting. And for many, the true cost of survival was that they lived long enough to remember. Thank you for listening to this episode of Boring History for Sleep. Wherever you are listening tonight, may your trench be dry, your ration warm, and your dreams silent. Thank you.